Music of the Elves. As Amalie lay awake in her bed one night, unable to attain the peaceful sleep she craved, a melody drifted through her open window. At first, it was so faint she thought it came from within her own head. But over time, the music grew louder, swelling to breathtaking heights. She found herself drawn up out of her bed, her room, her house, walking into the trees behind her backyard. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard. It didn't matter that she hadn't the slightest clue where it was coming from. All she knew was that nothing else in her life mattered if she didn't reach its source. She reached a clearing, one she'd never seen in all the times she'd explored the forest before, and in its center there was a small pond, the moonlight beaming down to give its appearance a silver glow. At its edge stood a man blowing into a long, curved tube of a color which looked like it had at one point been white, but had yellowed from grime. At least, she thought it was a man. As Amalie stared, enchanted by the beautiful music, she noticed the man was taller than any person she had seen. He was skinnier, too, and his skin was a pale shade of gray. As she watched him play, the man met her eyes and walked slowly backward into the pond. Just like that, all of the air was sucked from Amalie's lungs. The silence that she suddenly found herself surrounded by was suffocating. Frantically, she ran to the water's edge, scanning its surface for any sign of the stranger or his instrument. Being closer to the pond, she could see that it was, in fact, silver. It was also beginning to recede into its center. She couldn't let it disappear. Without another thought, Amalie ran into the water and felt herself being pulled beneath it. Instinctively, she tried to swim. Her arms flapped ungracefully up and down in an attempt to pull her body back to the surface. But before she knew it, the water was over her ears, swallowing her whole. She had suspected before that she was dreaming when she had seen the musical man. Now she didn't suspect, but rather hoped she was dreaming. Because if she wasn't, she was going to drown. Except she didn't feel like she was underwater. She felt pretty dry. Still, Amalie didn't stop holding her breath until she opened her eyes and saw where she was standing. Like the silver of the pond, the street beneath her feet looked as if it were made of moonlight. What's more, it was suspended, a slender bridge held in place only by air. Amalie should have been surrounded by darkness, but all around her, above and below, floated lanterns flickering with purple flames. She glanced behind her and saw that one side of the bridge was connected to what seemed to be a town. She could see buildings and more people who looked similar to the man from before. Amalie didn't take long to examine what was behind her, though, because somewhere in front of her, on the other side of the bridge, the music that she had heard before played softly through the air. It was much quieter than before, to the point where she could just barely make out some of the notes, but not others. It was taunting her, giving her a taste of what she so desperately craved, but not enough to satisfy the deep aching of her bones to be closer. Somewhat dazed, she walked towards it, cautious of the very close edges of the bridge. Amongst the dim glowing of the lanterns, a large circular building came into view. The edges of the bridge suddenly felt a lot further away, and she took off into a sprint. But as she grew closer to the structure, she could see that the bridge ended in a sudden drop-off, around 20 feet before the building. Amalie stopped dead. The music drifted sweetly toward her, beckoning her to come closer. She wanted to. Her whole body itched to continue drawing near. She would have departed from her body, crawled out of her skin, and floated towards it if she could. Part of her wondered if she should just step off the bridge and see what happened. If somehow it brought her closer to the music, then she won. And even if stepping off the bridge sent her plummeting, her impending death would have been 1,000 times better than never being able to properly hear the sweet music. As she began to put her foot forward, a hand caught her own. Amalie's head shot up, and she found herself face to face with the man from before. Except now he seemed somehow even less human, as he smiled down at her from where he stood, just on top of one of the floating lanterns. He seemed to want her to step up to it, too. Without his instrument, the man did not seem as inviting as before. He did not feel at all trustworthy or warm, and through her hazy cloud of longing, Amalie considered continuing off of the bridge in the other direction. Then he spoke. "I'll take you to it. The music." His voice was almost as lovely as the music itself. Entranced, Amalie put her foot out awkwardly, the lantern just a little too far for comfort, so that her legs were stretched apart and she had to work to bring her other foot up. The man's grip on her was strong, though, despite the lantern being the only thing supporting him, and she did not stumble when she jumped the rest of the way onto the lantern. The man stepped back onto the next lantern heading towards the music. When he did, he let go of Amalie. For a moment she swayed, feeling suddenly and impossibly high up. Eventually, though, she followed, more confidently this time, and soon she was practically skipping through the darkness, hopping from lantern to lantern without a second thought. When she finally reached the building, the music was louder than it had been even in the forest. As she followed the tall, non-human man inside, she saw at least a dozen similar-looking creatures on a stage. Each of their instruments was of the same aged white material as the man's, and when they played, the music came together so seamlessly, it was as if the group were of one mind. There were rows of seats before her, leading to the stage. Curiously, not one was occupied, but she didn't let this deter her from nearly running down the aisle and planting herself in the front row. When she sat down, she closed her eyes. She wanted to see nothing, to be cast in complete darkness. She wanted to become the music, and for the music to become her, and for there to be nothing but the two of them, dancing in the nothingness. Hours passed, the song transforming several times over to a new one, each just as lovely and enchanting as the last. It might as well have been minutes. It might as well have been years. The music eventually softened until it faded into nothing. Amalie hardly noticed at first, still lost in her own universe. When she finally opened her eyes, she was surprised to see the man sitting next to her. In her hours of bliss, she had forgotten him completely, forgotten everything but the sound of the instruments. Now she blinked, the feverish haze of musical bliss seeping out of her slightly, enough to be aware that she was in a strange place, with a strange man, in her nightgown. "Where are we?" she whispered, almost inaudibly, as if she had forgotten how to speak. "We're at the music hall," the man said, a hint of amusement in his melodic voice. Amalie looked around at the seats, the stage with the instruments now abandoned by their players. That seemed obvious to her. "But, I mean," she began, "this isn't the pond?" Suddenly, the non-humanness of him struck her once more, a little fear poking through her awe. "What are you?" He lifted an eyebrow, the question seeming to have struck him as funny. "I am Achilles." But what are you? Suddenly, Oculus burst out laughing, throwing his head back to give Amalie a perfect view of teeth that were not at all like her own. Short, thin points stared back at her, sharpened to pierce even the thickest skin. But the laugh itself was warm, not at all menacing in the way his appearance made him seem. I keep the music safe from the likes of you and yours. But if you must have a name to call my kind, I believe you could say I was an elf. She wanted to tell him that he didn't resemble an elf in the slightest, but that seemed an insignificant thing to say, when this seemed to be an entirely different world. Instead, she asked, "Where did the musicians go? I could have listened to them play forever." "Home for the night. Everybody needs a break. Forever would be a long time to stand there playing for a single audience member, don't you think?" "When will they be back?" The question came out more hurried than she had intended, and she realized she sounded like an addict waiting for their next fix. She thought that maybe she was now, for she had no intention of leaving. She would have sat there until the musicians came back and continued waiting every day until she could hear the music again. The elf seemed to sense this in her, and he smiled again, this time with his mouth closed so it appeared more comforting. "Don't worry, you'll be able to hear them again, but for now you will need rest as well." Achilles leaned forward, and with a hand covered the top of her head. Then everything was dark. When Amalie next opened her eyes, she was met with her small bedroom, awash in sunlight streaming in from outside. Had it all been a dream? Or maybe a nightmare, she thought, remembering those small, sharp teeth. She felt strangely cold, despite the summer air having been warm enough to leave the window open all night. When she stood, her breath caught in her throat, her nightgown brushed her calf, and cool drops of water fell from its hem to touch the tops of her feet. Amalie carefully grabbed a fistful of the material, needing to be certain. Her nightgown was unquestionably damp. It was not the kind of dampness that might occur if one were to find themselves sweating during a hot night. It was as though she had been submerged in water and was only beginning to dry off. Without a thought, Amalie strode towards the door. Her feet carried her to the front door as fast as she could go without alerting the rest of her family. Once outside, she practically ran to the tree line, and once inside the woods, she darted in the direction she thought she had gone the previous night, searching frantically for the pond or any sign of its or the elf's existence. Finally, she reached a familiar spot and nearly fell as she came to a halt. She stood in a clearing that looked exactly like the one from the night before. Only there was no pond. There was nothing but grass and sky and trees. But she was certain this was it. Now the only question was how to make the pond come back. Amalie waited until dark, and when her family had fallen asleep, she crept away. In the moonlit forest, she searched again for the spot where the pond had been. When she reached the clearing, she suppressed the urge to squeal. Silver glistened before her, and she barely even hesitated before running into the water. She felt it sweep over her again, pulling her into the darkness before being spat back out into the light. Once more, she found herself standing on a moonlight street. She had done it. She was back. But the music was not. The street was loud. Instead of being on the bridge, Amalie found herself at the center of the town, the air overtaken with laughter and words she did not recognize. None of the noise was anything like what she had wanted to hear. Nevertheless, she began walking towards the music hall. The night before, Amalie had walked in a daze, nearly running to chase the sweet notes. There was an urgency, a desire of needing to be as close to the instruments as she possibly could. Now, without the music to guide her, Amalie walked much slower, every step carefully made to not attract more attention to herself. The elves, whom she had scarcely paid attention to before, she now noticed were stopping to watch her as she walked. They stared at her, some with malice or contempt. Others seemed to believe that she was a nasty piece of gum that had stuck to the bottom of their shoe. A couple of them smiled at her as she passed, revealing small, sharp teeth like the ones Achilles had shown her before. Her stomach churned, and little beads of sweat began to make her shiver. When she made it to the lanterns, her confidence completely went out. Before, she'd had almost no hesitation to jump on. She'd been desperate, aching to be closer to the music. Now, she wondered just how pretty the music had been to make her want to do such a thing. Purple light flickered, illuminating the space around each lantern, so that she could see a clear path to the music hall. But below, there was nothing but pitch black. Nothing was enticing her now, and the sea of darkness appeared never-ending. She stepped back, only to yelp at the feeling of bumping into someone. Spinning around, she saw Achilles standing behind her, eyes glinting with amusement in the flickering purple light. "The musicians aren't playing today," he said. Amalie swallowed hard, trying to calm her nerves so she didn't sound as breathless as she felt. Why? "Well, do musicians play at the music halls every single day where you're from?" She thought for a second, but Achilles answered his own question. "Of course not. They have lives, too." "When will they be back?" The desperation in her voice surprised her. Though today some of the allure was gone, the sound of the music not there to invite her and persuade her to face her fears in an unknown world, she still felt the longing drawn out in her, hearing that she would not be able to enjoy the beautiful playing again tonight. "Not for another 3 nights, I'm afraid." She dropped her eyes, disappointed. "But if you'd like, I can show you something else tonight." His voice was soft, and when she met his eyes again, she saw a look in them that said he understood, and he wanted to make it up to her. Amalie nodded. Wordlessly, he took her hand and began guiding her away from the edge of the bridge, back towards the lines of buildings and elves who looked at her a little less bitterly with Achilles by her side. Now that she was not so focused on going toward the music, she truly took in the setting around her. Almost all of the buildings were the size of skyscrapers. They looked like they were cut out of cloth, patched together in strange, mismatched patterns to form tent-like structures. Though oddly shaped, it became clear through window-type flaps cut through the cloth what many of them were. There were restaurants and shops, and many appeared to be houses, but some were unfamiliar. One building had a display outside that held glass balls of swirling mist. An elf that seemed younger than the rest, shorter and less composed, accidentally knocked one over, and as he scurried around a corner, the orb emitted a few melodic notes. Amalie strained to listen closer, but the music didn't last long. The lanterns that floated nearest the orbs did, however, glow brighter for several seconds. Another storefront held rows of things that looked like children's scooters with a wider base, and an extension off the handlebars that had a harmonica attached. Amongst all the structures, there was one tiny shop that looked out of place. It looked normal by her standards, at least. It was shorter than the rest of the buildings, but still tall enough to stand a foot above even the tallest of the elves. It wasn't made of cloth, but sturdy yellow brick. The roof was shingled, and the door and window frames were a midnight shade of blue. Achilles was leading Amalie in its direction. A bell above the door chimed as they entered, but there was no one else inside. The walls were bare, save the one behind them, with no other doors to signal any separate rooms from the one in which they stood. In the center of the room, there was a single podium on top of which sat a glowing screen. Aklis let go of Amalie's hand and walked over to the podium. From behind it, he pulled out an instrument that looked similar to the one he had played that first night, a bone-white tube. He blew into it, and Amalie let out a deep sigh as the sweet sound filled the small room. With his free hand, Aklis gestured for her to come closer and peer into the screen atop the podium. When she did, Amalie's breath hitched in her throat. There, in front of her, were the sleeping faces of her parents. The music stopped, and the faces faded. Aklis spoke. It can show you anything and any place you want it to. It's how we find people like you. People like me? People who can hear our music. You mean not everyone can? No. Why do you think only you came to meet me last night in the forest, while your family stayed sleeping? Amalie hadn't considered this. She had only thought of the music. She had needed to be closer to the music. Now that she wasn't distracted by her yearning, it was apparent that this situation was incredibly bizarre, and Aklis was a stranger. Her mind wandered to the sharp rows of teeth lying behind his smile, and she found herself inching away. Aklis noticed his expression turning from the warmth he had been displaying before to something more tender, something sadder. Is there anything you want to ask? He said. She could tell he hoped she would, so that he could try and ease her worried mind. She was happy to oblige. Why do you want to find people like me? Whatever way he answered this question could clear up a lot of things at once, like if he was trustworthy, and why she was there to begin with. My world thrives on music. It's used in everything we do. It's why the musicians play for an empty hall. They're playing for the whole world. But why do you need me? People like you are rare. When you hear our music, your bones cry out to it. That's why you sought it out so passionately. And when you come into our world, and when you sit in the music hall and listen to the musicians play, the wonder that you feel becomes something tangible. We use it to make our music stronger, and it creates magic. The explanation sounded like nothing but a string of pretty words. It didn't make sense to her, and there was a weight sitting in the pit of her stomach that wanted her to move further from Aklis, to go back home and fall asleep and forget this place existed. As she felt her feet beginning to do just that, Aklis started playing again. Now his words made more sense. This is what he had meant, this wonder. This was the only home she ever wanted to know again. Of course this feeling could create enough magic to power a universe. He reached towards her and placed her hand in his. On the screen, instead of the sleeping faces of her parents, her own empty bed now appeared. A small sliver of confusion broke through the clouds in her mind. Wait. Her voice was tinted with the feeling of betrayal as Aklis pulled her hand closer. What are you doing? He pulled her hand down onto the screen, and the shop faded around her. Suddenly, she was lying on her bed, sunlight streaming in through the window. That night, Amalie went back into the forest. She wasted no time, heading straight to the clearing. Though it was already dark outside, the pond wasn't there. She wondered if there was some kind of time limit, aside from the setting of the sun. She was certain that she hadn't come any later than the previous night, so maybe it would open if she just waited a bit longer. So she waited, and waited. The forest was quiet, save for the crickets and the occasional owl. In her thin pajamas, the summer air felt cooler than she would have anticipated. At some point, she sat down, her legs growing weak. But she didn't take her eyes off the spot where the pond should have been. She still wasn't sure if Achilles could be trusted. She had considered all day whether she should even come back to the forest. But ultimately, Amalie's curiosity, the need to know why Achilles had brought her there, the need to hear the music again, had won out. She sat for hours, just knowing that if she could wait a few more minutes, she would get what she wanted. The pond would appear. Eventually, little beams of sunshine began spilling through the trees. Anxiously, Amalie stood and brushed the pieces of grass from her pajamas. She would have kept waiting much longer if she could. She would have waited until dark again, and on into the next morning. But she knew if she didn't get back soon, her family would notice she was gone. Reluctantly, she went home and climbed into bed. When it became evening again, Amalie went back into the forest. This time she didn't even wait for her family to go to sleep or the sun to set completely. She figured that if she had missed the pond's opening the night before, then she needed to go even earlier. So she told her family that she wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to bed early. Then she locked her bedroom door and climbed out of her window. Same as the night before, the pond was not there. Still, Amalie waited. She was determined that it would come back. Achilles said that the elves needed her. Except he hadn't. He'd said they needed people like her. Amalie fiddled with the hem of her shirt as she stared at the grass-covered mound. Her heart was suddenly beating much faster than it had even last night, while she waited anxiously for hours. Coming earlier hadn't worked. A feeling like ice water spread through her veins. Achilles wouldn't abandon her, was all she could think. But then, why wouldn't he? They were hardly friends. They were complete strangers. He did, after all, have a machine that could lead him to anyone else with whatever peculiarity Amalie possessed. Maybe showing her that was a warning, a way of letting her know he had no reason to keep coming back to her. And maybe that was just what the elves did, luring people out of their beds, drawing them in with their music, toying with them just to take it all away. Her temperament having taken a shift, Amalie began to stomp back towards the house. She wouldn't stand there all night again and make a fool of herself. Achilles wouldn't make her a fool. A few lovely notes drifted into her ears. All angry thoughts of unjust abandonment fled her mind, and she sprinted back to the clearing to see Achilles standing beside the silver water of the pond, smirking. "You got here fast." She didn't tell him she'd been waiting for him. She didn't say anything to him. Instead, walking right past him, straight into the water. As she suspected, a melody could be heard coming from the direction of the music hall. She materialized in the town square, right as it began to swell, the volume becoming nearly deafening. Several seconds later, Achilles appeared behind her. She didn't stop to talk to him, though, rushing toward the end of the bridge. As she ran, Amalie could feel him following closely behind her. Part of her wanted to stop, but the pull of the music was stronger than it had been before. She didn't feel she could slow down even slightly. Every part of her burned, aching to be closer to the instruments and their players. She reached the doors. When had she even jumped onto the first lantern? It didn't matter. She'd made it. As the door opened, she felt hands push her inside. The music came to an abrupt halt as Amalie skidded on hands and knees, several feet across the hard floor. She shook her head, dazed by the unceremonious entrance. Had Achilles pushed her? She looked up and saw the stage, devoid of the ensemble that had previously adorned it, occupied now by a long, narrow table. Arms lifted her from behind, and she thrashed, trying to turn her head so she could see if it was Achilles that held her up. She couldn't see anything but the empty auditorium. She felt herself carried up steps, and all around her the musicians from the first night swarmed out of the wings to join her on stage. When they laid her down on the table, she screamed, she flailed, trying to get off the table and run, but too many arms held her in place. Among the faces floating around her, Achilles was nowhere to be seen. One elf approached her feet with a long, jagged blade. Amalie only caught a glimpse before it disappeared outside of the line of her vision. She was kept too flat on the table to see where it had gone, but seconds later, she felt the metal brush her left calf, and then burning. Warm blood trickled down the side of her leg. She kicked instinctively, but no part of her moved, her screams now filling the hall at a volume the music had never even dared to reach, did nothing to deter the elves. An eternity passed in nothing but the sound of her own screams, which reached an even higher magnitude as she felt the blade begin to grind through her bone. When at last the sawing ceased, Amalie lay, gasping sobs racking her body. Slowly, hands lifted her, allowing her to sit. Somewhere amid her screams, they had skillfully stitched her closed, just below the knee. She whimpered at the side of it, a bloody stump where she should have had a healthy, complete leg. Several feet away, she could see where they were working on her now dismembered calf, scraping flesh away from the bone. It seemed they were hollowing it out. Suddenly, Amalie remembered the strange way that the color of Achilles' instrument had struck her that first night at the pond. Now she could see it was the same pale yellowy white as the bone they had just taken from her. She looked away. Achilles was still nowhere to be found among the elves surrounding her. There weren't as many holding her now, and the ones that did were more relaxed in their grip, whispering to each other in some language she didn't know. They knew she wouldn't have been able to run now, even if she tried. She wondered if they would have taken more of her bones, if this was merely an intermission before they came back for the other leg. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She was in so much pain, even now. She couldn't imagine going through it again. But just as she had the thought, one of the elves placed a hand on top of her head. Her eyes rolled back. The pain was gone. That was the first thing she noticed when Amalie opened her eyes again. The second was that she was in her bed. Memories of her flesh being torn apart swarmed her, and she shivered, despite the thick blankets draped over her. She glanced down at where her legs lay below the covers. She didn't want to lift them. She would sit there, perpetually resigned to relive her nightmare over and over again, if it meant she never had to find out if it was real. For a long time, she did just that, staring at the blankets, trying to see through them to gauge if both legs were underneath. Eventually, the shivering stopped, and an uneasy curiosity began to settle within her. It had to have been a nightmare, a long, drawn-out nightmare. She knew it was. All she needed to do was push the blankets back, and she would see that both legs were perfectly fine. But the memory of metal gnawing through her bone made her anxiety stay. She felt like she was a small child, waiting for daylight to come so she could see that the chair in the corner of her room wasn't a monster. She couldn't look. As long as she didn't look, she could keep herself convinced that her leg was, indeed, still there. "Amalie," her mother's voice at the door. "Breakfast is ready." "Coming." Steeling herself, she pushed back the blankets.